Welcome to Kungfu Explained and the third episode of the Hidden History of Shuai Jiao series. In the last episode, we looked at the fervent nationalistic mentality that existed in China at the end of the Qing dynasty and throughout the Republican era. We saw how the prominent figure of this time, Ma Liang, was responsible not only for the promotion and development of Shuai Jiao into the official realms of both the national, military, and education systems, but how he was also responsible for its naming, as well as the creation of its underlying origin stories. It was his efforts that led to Shuai Jiao being officially recognized since then. We also saw how the political environment shaped a Han-centric writing of this history of the art, and how this has been carried forward up until today. We have seen how the links to both the Mongol Manchu origins and the people directly connected with the promulgation of the art were erased and deliberately ignored. Now we'll look at the archaeological, cultural, and historical evidence pertaining to the art. We will look at the origins of the Shan Pu Ying and the structure within the Qing governing system, as well as the prominent wrestlers who came out of it. Through this, we will have a clearer understanding of the true roots of Shuai Jiao and the people and culture from which it stems. Today, the prominent schools, or so-called styles of Shuai Jiao, are the Beijing style, the Tianjin style, and the Baoding Kuai Jiao, or fast wrestling style. While people quite frequently call these different styles, we should be clear that what is actually being referred to is three streams that run from the same source. They are all, in fact, what we call today's Chinese Shuai Jiao, and they utilize the same outfit and can compete under the same rules. What is actually being referred to is three approaches to practice and expressions that, in relatively recent history, evolved following Shan Pu Ying wrestlers handing down their arts within these differing areas. As with any martial art, lineages will slightly evolve and develop in somewhat different manners through the people within a specific area where it is being handed down over time. However, in almost all cases, the art is still considered the same art and has the same technical core and source. While it is common today to attribute the roots of these so-called different styles to differing ancient sources, we will now look at these in greater detail to show how they are all in fact stemming from the Qing dynasty's Shan Pu Ying. The Shan Pu Ying was an influential imperial wrestling institute situated in Beijing that was officially established by the Manchu Qing government. We will cover details pertaining to the Shan Pu Ying later on. In the last episode, we saw that Ma Liang's own wrestling practice came through Ping Jinyi. Ping's wrestling, himself being a representative of the Muslim mosque street martial arts of Baoding, combined Manchu and Mongol wrestling that was common in the Qing dynasty, along with Shaolin or long-style boxing, to create a fast and proactive style of Shuai Jiao.
少林功夫醒，好好嘢。少林功夫勁，係好勁。
This style is what is called the Baoding Kuai Jiao style, or fast wrestling style. It was this system that Ma Liang systemized, and which the large majority of today's Shuai Jiao practice can be traced back to. Let's take a look at the roots of the Beijing and Tianjin styles next. The style of Shuai Jiao that is practiced in Beijing is a descendant of the Shan Pu Ying through an immensely popular school of wrestling that was established there, known as the Tianqiao Wrestling School. This school was established by Wan Baiye, who was also known as Wan Yongshun. He was both an instructor and member of the Qing Imperial Shan Pu Ying. Following the collapse of the Qing dynasty, Wan Yongshun established a wrestling school in the Tianqiao district of Beijing, which at that time was an area known for its various forms of public entertainment and performances that were aimed at the lower strata of society. Wang Yongshun taught the Shan Pu Ying skills there to the general public. Interestingly, one of his closed-door disciples named Bao Shanlin, who was also known as Bao San, was responsible for creating a blend of comedic crosstalk known as Xiangsheng and Shuai Jiao into a form of comedic wrestling performance that became known as Wu Xiangsheng.
他这么着行不行？您看，那你说怎么着？哎，我把脚往这一放，只要他今儿给我踢动了，动了窝，怎么着？算他赢。 啊，给腿踢折就完了呗。踢折就完了。白踢啊，没错，踢折白踢。来吧，来，撤，到。
原来这就是天桥摔跤的一段表演了。
His students would put on comedic shows that included wrestling skits, as well as long flag post displays, named 中翻 as a means to earn a living. Nonetheless, this type of wrestling performance is known as Tianchao Shuai Jiao today, and is recognized as an official intangible cultural heritage of China. It is important to note that originally, Wan Yongshun taught pure wrestling initially. As was practiced in the Shan Pu Ying, Bao Shanlin was a highly skilled wrestler who was well known for his abilities, as were many other students of Wan Baiye or Wan Yongshun. The vast majority of today's Beijing practitioners of Shuai Jiao trace their lineages back to the Tianchao area, to Wan Yongshun, and ultimately to the Mongol Manchu wrestling of the Shan Pu Ying. Other Shan Pu Ying wrestlers also began to teach publicly in the Beijing area following the collapse of the Qing dynasty and the disbanding of the Shan Pu Ying. With that, the Beijing style of Shuai Jiao is a direct descendant of the Manchu-Mongol wrestling of the Shan Pu Ying. Now let's take a look at the roots of Tianjin's Shuai Jiao. Tianjin lies next to Beijing, and as was the case in Beijing following the collapse of the Qing dynasty, some Shan Pu Ying wrestlers went into the public sphere and taught their Qing court art there to the general public. Tracing the lineages of the revered teachers of Shuai Jiao in Tianjin, we find that there is an extremely deep connection with the wrestlers of Beijing. When tracing the lineages of the Shuai Jiao wrestlers who transmitted their art in Tianjin, we find they lead to one specific person named Cui Xiufeng, who was also nicknamed Xiao Gui Cui, which means Little Devil Cui. According to legend, this nickname was given to him by the Empress Dowager Cixi herself. Cui Xiufeng was a well-known bannerman wrestler of the Shan Pu Ying. His students included Wang Kunshan, who was also known as Wang Eryuan, as well as the well-known Tianjin wrestling champion Bu Enfu. In his later years, Cui Xiufeng gave his Shan Pu Ying Shuai Jiao training equipment, as well as his old Qing government official uniform, to Bu Enfu, which represented that he recognized Bu Enfu as his official successor. Bu Enfu was born in Tianjin in the year 1911. In 1930, he traveled to Beijing to study under Little Devil Cui. As Bu was Cui's sixth disciple, he was also called Bu the Sixth. He became well known within both Beijing and Tianjin for his Shuai Jiao skills. He later went on to study Western boxing under Italian coaches as well. As was mentioned in the previous episode, it was during this Republican era that China began to promote and develop sports within the Republic based on the Western sporting model. And Bu Enfu's study of boxing at this time is yet another example of this initiative. With that, he became quite proficient in Western boxing as well. He also began the study of Yi Quan, which is also known as Da Cheng Quan, under the founder of the art, Wang Shangjai. In 1934, he became the national middleweight boxing champion. In 1935, Bu Enfu participated in the National Shuai Jiao Championships, held in Shanghai at the 6th National Games. Throughout the event, he defeated numerous well-known wrestlers, and in the final, he defeated Bao Shanlin of Beijing Tianchao fame to become the national middleweight Shuai Jiao champion. He taught numerous high-level Shuai Jiao practitioners throughout his life, and was one of the main influences on what is known as Tianjin Shuai Jiao. He passed away in 1986. Other prominent Tianjin Shuai Jiao practitioners include the four Zhangs. The four Zhangs included Zhang Hongyu, Zhang Kuiyuan, Zhang Henian, and Zhang Liansheng. Zhang Hongyu was born in 1912, and he studied Shuai Jiao under another prominent student of the Shan Pu Ying's Little Devil Cui Xiufeng named Wang Kunshan. Wang Kunshan was one of the main disseminators of Shuai Jiao in the Tianjin area. Zhang Hongyu went on to become the head coach of the Tianjin Shuai Jiao team, which became a nationally prominent place to study the art. The so-called Tianjin style is characterized by the Shuai Jiao of Bu Enfu, Wang Kunshan, and later on Zhang Hongyu, and all of their Shuai Jiao stems from the Shan Pu Ying wrestler Little Devil Cui Xiufeng. Hence, in actuality, the Shuai Jiao of Tianjin, like that of Beijing, also stems directly from and is a descendant of the Manchu Mongol wrestling of the Shan Pu Ying. We can see that when tracing the lineages of these so-called different styles of Shuai Jiao, we find they all in fact lead back to the Shan Pu Ying members who taught their art publicly following the collapse of the Qing dynasty. Maliangs codified wrestling, which he named Shuai Jiao, can be described as the systemization of the wrestling practices that were popular in the area of the north of China surrounding the capital of the Qing dynasty, namely Beijing, where the Shan Pu Ying was located and where these wrestlers disseminated their art to the general public following the collapse of the dynasty. While over time we see that within the areas of Beijing, Tianjin, and Baoding, slightly different approaches and focuses emerged within the practice for various reasons. They all, however, stem from the same source, being the Manchu-Mongol wrestling of the Shan Pu Ying. It was directly due to Ma Liang's efforts, combined with his prominent position within the Republican government, that today's Shuai Jiao was systemized and promoted on a somewhat national scale officially by the government. As described in the previous episode, it was this that directly led to its prominence in the Republican era, and its continuation to a degree up until today. Next, let's take a look at the Qing dynasty's wrestling camp, the Shan Pu Ying. It is important to have a degree of understanding regarding the Manchus and the banner system in order to have a clearer picture of the Shan Pu Ying itself. While I will not go into overt detail regarding the fascinating topic of the Manchus, and by extension their Qing government formation and structure, there are some relevant aspects that I will present here. Those of you that would like to research this topic deeper may refer to the sources I have referenced in this series, such as Mark Elliott's The Manchu Way, as well as China Marches West, The Qing Conquest of Central Asia by Peter Perdue. In previous episodes of this series, as well as my Shaolin Legacy series, I presented some information regarding the origin of the Manchus, who are the descendants of the Tungusic Jurchen or Nuzhen tribes, which hailed from the forests and fields in northeast China in what is today's Jilin and Heilongjiang provinces. As the description of Mark Elliott's The Manchu Way states, in 1644, the Manchus, a relatively unknown people inhabiting China's rude northeastern frontier, overthrew the Ming, Asia's mightiest rulers, and established the Qing dynasty, which endured to 1912. From this event arises one of history's greatest conundrums. How did a barely literate alien people manage to remain in power for nearly 300 years over a highly cultured population that was vastly superior in number? Part of the answer to this fascinating question lies within the early Qing's ability to subjugate and incorporate various Jurchen tribes as well as Mongol groups, which arguably were their greatest threat under the leadership of the Qing. These tribes were united under a banner system by Aisinggyoro Nurhaci into the Manchu people when he formed the Qing dynasty. It is important to understand that the inner Asian tribes, particularly the Mongols, were always going to be the greatest threat to the empire's power. The world still remembers the might of a united Mongolian empire. Alliances and diplomacy were crucial in order to maintain the support and allegiance of the Mongols and Jurchen tribes. As is stated in China Marches West by Peter Perdue, the Manchus' relations with the neighboring Mongol tribes were crucial to the strengthening of the state from its earliest years. Kinship and ideological intimacy tied them closely together. It was this combined group under the Qing that managed to overthrow the Ming and conquer China. Following conquest, maintaining these diplomatic relations was crucial to eliminate any threats to the Qing Empire from within Inner Asia. Keep this in mind as we discuss the role of the Shan Pu Ying shortly. During his consolidation of power, Nurhaci subjugated rival Jurchen tribes in the northeast and would then incorporate them as military companies of 300 men, called Niru, within his army state. These companies were the foundation of the Qing Banners. The Manchus built their powerful, centralized state based on their banner system, which cross-cut tribal allegiances. These banners incorporated some of the traditional tribal leadership that existed among both the Mongols and the Jurchens into non-tribal organizations. In essence, the Manchus managed to transform the clan society of the Manchu and by extension Mongol tribes into a centralized bureaucratic state. The system was derived primarily from the Manchu practice of organizing military maneuvers as hunting expeditions. As Mark Elliott states in The Manchu Way, it is generally believed that the banner system traced its origins to the methods used in conducting large-scale hunts, called aba in Manchu, and commonly referred to in English by the French term battue. Hunting culture was something the Manchus shared with most of the historic peoples of North Asia, including the Jurchens, the Khitans, and of course, the Mongols. This form of the chase lasted several days. It commonly took place in the fall and required careful coordination and strict discipline, not to mention personal courage and a steady hand. A cornered tiger or bear, after all, was as dangerous as any human foe, so it is not surprising that the aba were thought of as quasi-military maneuvers. As the Liao Emperor once said about the Khitan tribal hunt, it is not simply a pleasure, it is a means of practicing warfare. And as is stated in China Marches West, by its final form in 1623, the banners were based on the Niru, Arrow, Company, which was originally a hunting and fighting unit of the Manchus, very similar to the Kosygin of the Mongols in the 13th and 14th century. The Gusa banner, like the Kosygin, was based on the able-bodied men of a tribe or other autonomous political unit when considered as a military force. Its head was a hereditary prince, and its official titles were modeled on the Mongolian ones. Thus, the central institution that provided the backbone of the Manchu conquest could be traced to Mongolian roots. The Qing 8 banners were formed in the early days of the empire. Those people that were originally included in the banners remained so permanently, and membership in the banners was handed down in a hereditary fashion. With that, the banners were in fact what defined someone as a so-called Manchu, and this was a closed system, meaning that one could not become a member of the banners from the outside through other means apart from hereditary methods. As is stated in Mark Elliott's book, each banner is divided into 3 sections. The tribes that were originally Nurhachis make up the Manchu section. The various bow-drawing peoples from the northern desert form the Mongol section, while the descendants of people from Liaodong, former Ming commanders and emissaries, those from the other dynasty who defected with multitudes of soldiers and captives, are separately attached to the Chinese banners. The 8 banners proved a flexible tool of empire building. The differentiated ethnic hierarchy described above, according to which Manchus generally outranked their Mongol cousins and both outranked Chinese bannermen. The banners themselves were then defined clearly, as is stated here, namely into Manchu banners, Mongol banners, and Han Chinese banners. All bannermen were in effect professional soldiers and were not permitted to be employed in any other way apart from being soldiers or within official government positions. They received a monthly stipend and received other benefits. All banner households were required to provide a certain number of warriors and soldiers to the empire. Their job was to be soldiers, and they were expected to maintain their warrior skills and lifestyle. Bannermen lived separately within walled-off garrison cities that regular Chinese could not live in. These, in essence, were military compounds, off-limits to non-bannermen. Beijing, being the capital, is the most striking example of this. Surrounding the imperial city and the imperial palace, only bannermen could live within Beijing's city walls, and the areas directly surrounding the imperial palace were reserved for the Manchu banners only. The inspiration for this was Manchu hunting formations and their field encampments, in which soldiers' tents formed a protective circle around the emperor's yurt, and this in turn recalled the Mongol Ordo setup. As stated in the Manchu Way, that Manchu banners, not Mongol or Chinese banners, were situated closest on all sides of the imperial city, underscores the degree to which Altaic traditions and security concerns, and not geomancy, determined the look of the capital. These aspects are important as we continue looking into the Shan Pu Ying. Building and maintaining a good relationship with the Mongols was of extreme importance to the Manchus, and this was the case already from the establishment of the dynasty. The inner Asian tribes would always be the biggest threat to the Manchu dynasty, and hence they paid great attention to this issue. Cultural activities were used as tools by the Qing dynasty to promote good relations with the Mongols, and these included horse racing, horse wrangling, Mongolian music, and of course wrestling. In a document titled The Relationship Between the Development Process of Wrestling in the Qing Dynasty and the Politics of the Qing Dynasty, written by Liu Yuhuan, he states that wrestling was in fact one of the threads that held the fabric of the alliance between the Mongols and the Manchus together. Already prior to the conquest of the Ming Dynasty, the Manchus would regularly hold banquets for the Mongols, at which wrestling was one of the key activities and connected to both entertainment and ritual. As we know, wrestling has been a key part of Mongolian culture since time immemorial. They labeled horse racing, archery, and wrestling as the three manly sports, and these have been the key elements at Mongolian Nadam festivals even up until today. Nadam are the most important festivals for the Mongolian people and have been held for many centuries. Initially, they were festivals dedicated to gods and included ceremony and sacrifice. Under Chinggis, they grew in size and popularity as he had united the various tribes of Mongolia. The best of the Mongolian soldiers would take part in the horse riding, archery, and wrestling, with wrestling being the primary event even today. This should give one insight into the level of importance that wrestling holds for Mongolians, even in comparison with other inner Asian groups. As you can understand, already at this time, such events were utilized by Chinggis for diplomatic purposes, and to further reinforce bonds and alliances forged between the various Mongolian tribes. This is still echoed today, as many major sporting events are as much diplomatic endeavors as they are competitive events. The Manchus used such events and festivals for the same reason, and wrestling was a key part of this. Of course, it is only logical to understand that the wrestling styles and format would have to have been basically identical in order for this to happen. We can be fairly confident that due to the importance of wrestling within Mongolian culture, in the early Qing period, such exchanges would have been mostly influenced by the Mongolian cultures. It is recorded within Manchu records that in January 1632, when the Qing ruler, Hong Taiji, was the great Khan of both the Manchus and the Mongols, he awarded titles to 3 wrestlers who were Mongolian themselves, and he awarded these titles in Mongolian, not Manchu. It is stated that he invited these 3 to teach the Manchu youth. At this time, it is clear that the Mongols were technically ahead of the Manchus in buku, or wrestling, and that the emperor paid attention to this. The Mongolians were the most prominent wrestlers during this period, and they heavily influenced the wrestling from the early Qing onwards. The Shunzhi emperor, who ruled the Qing following Hong Taiji, was recorded as being outraged that the Manchus were still losing to the Khalkha Mongols, who had come to take part in a festival. The emperor ordered that wrestlers be recruited to defeat the Mongols. This also shows us that the wrestling format that was implemented was that of the Mongols. As was mentioned, Emperor Hong Taiji placed major importance on wrestling and its use as a tool for maintaining good relations with the Mongols. Wrestling was a constant feature at official banquets and celebratory festivals held by the Qing court, and was used for diplomatic purposes with the Mongols. We also know that many aspects of Manchu culture were adapted from Mongolian customs and practices. This includes the script utilized, as well as the clothing style of the Manchus. For example, in a letter Nurhaci wrote to the Khalkha Mongols in 1619, he states, "Only the speech of the nations of Chinese and Koreans is different. They are alike in the clothes they wear and in their way of life." Only the speech of our two nations, Mongol and Jurchen, is different. In the clothes we wear and our way of life, we are alike. And in another letter he states, although the languages of China and Korea are different, because their coiffures and style of dress are identical, those two countries are as one. Our two nations, Mongol and Jurchen, though originally speaking different languages, are as one, in the clothing we wear and in all our various modes of living. With that, it is quite clear that the wrestling of the Mongolians at this time, and following the establishment of the Shan Pu Ying, influenced that of the Manchus in both method and attire, particularly when wrestling was a key diplomatic tool between the groups. We will get into the historical aspects regarding the clothing a bit later on. The Shan Pu Ying, which can be translated as the camp of excellent wrestlers, was established by Emperor Kangxi. The Manchu name for the Shan Pu Ying was Buku Kifu Kuwaran. There are a few reasons for him establishing the Shan Pu Ying. Firstly, he, much like his grandfather, Hong Taiji, saw the need and benefit to maintain positive diplomatic relations with the Mongols, and this was done through wrestling. It is also said that Hong Taiji himself was fond of wrestling and practiced as well. A second aspect is recorded through the story of his ascension to the throne. It is said that in 1669, when Kangxi took control of the throne and had the de facto ruler, Oboi, arrested, it was Kangxi's personal guards who were trained wrestlers who subdued him. Kangxi had planned this for a long time, and to this end he had a group of wrestlers trained specifically for this task. It was in commemoration of this event that he had the official Shan Pu Ying wrestling camp established. Interestingly, the tale of the conflict between Kangxi and Oboi was included in the famous Jin Yong fictional novel The Deer and the Cauldron, where Oboi is portrayed as a power-hungry and cruel aristocrat who is overthrown by Kangxi with the help of Wei Xiaobo, who is the story's protagonist. Emperor Kangxi had the Shan Pu Ying camp established in Beijing and was predominantly focused on the training and development of wrestlers who would participate in imperial banquets and also serve as imperial bodyguards. All its members were bannermen, and it was comprised of 300 members, of which 200 were wrestlers, 50 were archers, and 50 were horsemen. According to research by Liu Yuhuan in his work titled The Development of Shuai Jiao During the Qing Dynasty, the camp was divided into two, namely a left and a right wing, from the perspective of the imperial palace. Each camp had its own commander, and both of these commanders reported to the same Zongtong Dachen, or president. The left wing was located at the Great Buddha Temple, and the right wing was located at Huguo Temple. The separation into two wings was in order to keep the wrestlers competitive, as each wing would aim to defeat and outdo the other. The bannermen, which comprised the Shan Pu Ying's wrestlers, were all adept at the art, and they were divided into 4 classes, from first class to 4th class, and they received a stipend based on their rank and skill level. They would be promoted and thus receive a higher salary by defeating a higher ranked wrestler. They would perform at imperial banquets and other festivals, and they would receive bonuses and rewards from the emperor for accompanying him on imperial hunts. By 1861, Kangxi established an imperial hunting ground outside of the Great Wall. Hunting culture was important to Manchu people, a tradition that was shared with most of the historic peoples of North Asia. It was an important paramilitary exercise that bannermen were required to participate in, as hunting, along with riding and skillful bow shooting, were hallmarks of the Manchu way, or Fedoro. These hunts, known as Muran, took place over many days in autumn, and it is important to take note that only Manchu and Mongol bannermen were allowed to participate. At these imperial hunts, the emperor would also invite inner Asian groups that shared in this hunting culture, namely Mongol, Turkic, and Tibetan lords and emissaries. The aim of this was diplomatic, but also to display the organized hunting prowess of the Manchu military machine in order to strike fear into these subjugated groups. Many festivities would also take place at the hunts, such as wrestling, and the Mongols and Manchus would compete fiercely. We have a visual record of one of such instances painted by the Italian Jesuit Giuseppe Castiglione, who was also known as Lang Shining. In his masterpiece titled Saiyan Si Shi Tu, or Watching 4 Performances at the Imperial Banquet in Northern China, we can see Emperor Qianlong watching the wrestling competition at the Imperial Hunt camp, which is accompanied by Mongolian musicians on the side. In the natural scenery, we can also see horse wrangling take place. From later yet, in the Qing dynasty, we have other records in which the Shan Pu Ying and its activities are mentioned as well as depicted. We find accounts in the Shanghai-based newspaper titled Shen Bao, which was published from April 1872 to May 1949. Its articles at times mention the Shan Pu Ying and refer to wrestling as Guanjiao. One example can be found in its February 18, 1889 edition, in which it states, "At 11:50 in the morning of the 23rd of the past first month, the emperor took seat on the imperial carriage and left for the Hall of Purple Splendor to ascend the treasured throne in the Yellow Tabernacle. All of the inner and outer Mongol lords, Beile and Beise, Taiji, Tabunang, and Great Lama, etc., were split into 2 wings according to order and rank. On the left, before the tent, was the ceremonial master. After the emperor concluded bestowing and dividing the tea to the Mongol lords, they were granted milk tea, kumis, food dishes, and baubles. Each of them knelt down and curtsied. When the emperor supped, he observed the wrestling of the men of the Shan Pu Ying, and through this division, official granted nameplates. The emperor decreed that Xiang and Shun and others, 16 in total, wrestle, perform camel acrobatics, horse acrobatics, and play various tunes from Mongol and Western territory at that venue. After this concluded, the emperor retired to the palace and the Mongol lords each left. The Shenbao newspaper was distributed widely throughout China when it was in publication, and it played an important role in the formulation of public opinion on matters it reported on. Reports such as the above were quite common in the newspaper, and in most cases it was similarly presented with a Shan Pu Ying always connected with the emperor and his diplomatic activities with his nomadic inner Asian subjects. By this time, the activity of wrestling was presented as a Manchurified imperial activity which was closely connected to the inner Asian nomadic identity. The Chinese general public would have seen it as part of the Manchu and Mongol identity as opposed to their own, and this mentality was carried forward into the early Republican era. An accompanying publication at this time was titled Dian Shi Zhai Hua Bao, or Dian Shi Zhai Pictorial, and it was a Chinese language magazine published in Shanghai in the late 19th century from 1884 to 1898. It was profusely illustrated supplement to the Shenbao newspaper and became wildly popular among its readers. Contributors included graphic artist Wu Youru. On page 15 of its 6th volume, we find an illustration of the Shan Pu Ying. We can see their attire quite vividly and clearly, which included the jacket, pants, along with covering leg sleeves, belts, and boots. We will come back to the attire in detail a little bit later on as well. As we have seen, wrestling was an important tool utilized by the Manchu imperials in order to foster and maintain positive diplomatic relations with its subjugated nomadic inner Asian tribes, most specifically the Mongols, who excelled at the art. The Manchus, like many of the inner Asian tribes in northern China, had a long heritage and tradition of wrestling. The Shan Pu Ying was established by Emperor Kangxi specifically to elevate the skill of Manchu wrestlers, in essence creating a professional wrestling league with the goal of excelling at the art which was a staple part of imperial banquets, particularly those in which the Mongols participated. As the Manchu emperor was also the great Khan of the subjugated Mongols, it would not be suitable for the Manchus to continually be defeated by the Mongols during such diplomatic events. Hence, the Manchus paid attention to this, and the Shan Pu Ying was established for this important diplomatic function. As has been stated and repeated by numerous modern-day Shuai Jiao proponents, the Shan Pu Ying wrestlers would also be appointed at times to serve as imperial bodyguards. With that, it is important to understand the Qing stipulations regarding the Imperial Guard system and what this confirms regarding who the Shan Pu Ying wrestlers themselves could and could not have been. An elite group that was contained within the Qing 8 banners was the Imperial Guard. It was separated into 3 corps, namely the Guard, the Vanguard, and the Imperial Bodyguard, in ascending order of exclusivity, pay, and prestige. These 3 Manchu institutions trace their origins prior to 1644 and the Qing conquest of China. The Guard, known as Hu Junying or Bara, was tasked with protecting the palace and its grounds. Its membership was limited to only those soldiers within the regular Manchu or Mongol banners. The Vanguard, or Qianfeng Ying, Gab Sihian, was tasked with leading a procession when the emperor left the palace, as well as leading attacks in battle. It was 1/10 the size of the Guard and comprised of approximately 1,500 men. Like the Guard, the Vanguard membership was also limited to Manchu and Mongol bannermen only. The Imperial Bodyguard, or Ling Shiwei, or Qin Junying, Hia, was the most elite group within the Imperial Guard, and they followed the emperor everywhere and were tasked with his personal safety at all times. Members of the Imperial Bodyguard were drawn only from the Manchu banners, and primarily from the upper 3 banners. As it was stated that the Shan Pu Ying members were Emperor Kangxi's personal bodyguards, and this practice continued following his reign, with imperial bodyguards also being drawn from the Shan Pu Ying members, we can understand that the members of the Shan Pu Ying would have been drawn from the same banners as the Imperial Guards are drawn, namely the upper 3 Manchu banners. This further makes sense when one sees the close proximity to the emperor which the Shan Pu Ying wrestlers were regularly at during imperial banquets and other performances. This should once again shed important light on the actual reality of the history of the Shan Pu Ying, its actual members, and Shuai Jiao in China, which is in contrast to the generally disseminated history of the art.
Houston, we have a problem.
This should give you some clear insight into the reality of the Shan Pu Ying, its origin, its original aims and role, as well as its function within the greater framework of the Qing imperial system. Most importantly, we can clearly see who its members were and from which ethnic groups they were drawn from. These groups carried with them the cultural practices of Mongol and Manchu wrestling, in particular Mongolian Bukh, which was the basis of the Shan Pu Ying and by extension Chinese Shuai Jiao as a whole. These aspects are crucial, as they are contradictory to the generally presented history and origin of the art. In most cases, these aspects are rarely even covered. The Shan Pu Ying ended with the end of the Qing dynasty and the move into the Republican period. We covered the art's origin and development during this period, as well as the anti-Manchu basis and rationale for the Han-centric rebranding of Shuai Jiao and its history in a previous episode. Now, let's take a look at the historical roots of Manchu and Mongol wrestling. As has been mentioned in earlier episodes, at no time prior to the Republican era was the term Shuai Jiao used, and even the initial characters used for Shuai Jiao in that period were different to the characters utilized later on and up to today. The Manchu term for wrestling was buku, and this term was also utilized in the Manchu name for the Shan Pu Ying, which was buku kifu kuwaran. This term was taken from the Mongolian language, directly from the term bokh. In the 70s, linguist William Rozicki did masterful research into the occurrence of Mongol loanwords in the Manchu language as part of his PhD thesis. His work, Mongol Elements in Manchu has been published by Sinor Research Institute of Inner Asian Studies. In it, he researches the etymology of Manchu words and identifies those that were directly taken from Mongolian and implemented into the Manchu language. Regarding the Manchu term for wrestling, buku, Rozicki's research shows that this term was indeed a loan word taken from the Mongolian language, and this occurred in relatively more recent history. The Jurchens were the ancestors of the Manchus. Through the unearthing of archaeological artifacts, it is believed that formalized Jurchen and Mongol wrestling stems from the Khitanese wrestling. The Khitan, or Khitan people, were a para-Mongolic nomadic people from Northeast Asia who established the Liao dynasty. In 1931, a vase was unearthed from the site of the ancient eastern capital of the Khitans in Manchuria, which dated back to Khitan Liao dynasty. On this vase, wrestlers are depicted wearing boots and some sort of jacket. It is generally accepted that the Manchus were influenced by and adopted Mongol wardrobe, as was discussed earlier. So, along with the Mongol style of wrestling that was adopted by the Manchus, so was the attire worn for this endeavor, which was already utilized in para-Mongolic groups such as the Khitan. We have seen how the Manchus started adopting Mongol wrestling prior to the establishment of the Shan Pu Ying, and following its establishment this continued, even down to the utilization of jackets, boots, and other items of clothing that the Mongols used. Let's take a closer look at the attire. Elements that the Shan Pu Ying wrestlers wore, which were shared with and most likely derived from those of Mongolian wrestling, include the open-chested wrestling jacket called the dalian, the leather boots, long trousers, and leggings or leg sleeves which cover the front of the legs. The Shan Pu Ying wrestlers also wore a belt, which was made of camel hair, and it is said that the floor they wrestled on was also covered with camel hair. The utilization of camel hair is an interesting detail, as camels were not animals that were kept by Han populations, and in fact were not native to the forested Manchu homelands either. They are animals that have been herded by nomadic Mongol tribes living in flat, arid, and desert areas for millennia. The use of camel hair by the Shan Pu Ying hints again at a Mongol and nomadic origin. While today's Inner Mongolian boch attire is generally standardized, in the not-too-distant past there were some slight differences between what they wore from area to area in Inner Mongolia, and in some areas, indeed, a prominent belt was utilized. As mentioned earlier, we can actually see a depiction of the Shan Pu Ying wrestlers and their attire from Volume 6 of the Dianshi Zhai Hua Bao. Illustrator Wu Youru gives us a vivid depiction of the Shan Pu Ying jackets, trousers, leggings, boots, and belts. In fact, their attire is much closer to what the Inner Mongolian wrestlers wear today than it is to modern Shuai Jiao practitioners. Another element that hints at the Mongol boch root of the Shan Pu Ying and Chinese Shuai Jiao can be found in a custom that the Shan Pu Ying wrestlers did prior to the commencement of a match. Shan Pu Ying wrestlers performed a ceremonial dance prior to the start of a bout, and this is maintained somewhat today in Beijing and Tianjin Shuai Jiao. Generally called Zoujia, it was also referred to as Paojia, Huanghua Jia, and Huanggua Jia. Here we can see the famed Beijing wrestler Li Baoru doing a demonstration of this. I'm sure it is obvious to you where this comes from.
Who the fuck is that guy?
Within Mongolian wrestling, a ceremonial and ritual dance called deve is performed as the wrestlers enter prior to the start of a bout, as well as following either winning or losing. In the past, it is said that each tribe had their own version of this dance, mimicking differing animals. This practice stems from the shamanistic beliefs of the Mongolian people. It is also relevant that the Manchus were originally also followers of shamanism. Today, the most common version performed within Inner Mongolia is the Makshikh, or lion dance. In the Hununbuir region of Inner Mongolia, a version called the Karailta is performed, which is said to mimic a prancing deer. In both cases, the actions of the arms and legs can be easily seen to resemble that of the Zhou Jia within Shuai Jiao. While the oftentimes given explanation for Zhou Jia within Shuai Jiao is that it displays one's level of skill and that one can determine a wrestler's ability from it, this hardly makes any sense when one evaluates it in actuality. Additionally, it is a rather illogical explanation when one knows about such practices within Mongolian wrestling. Most likely this explanation emerged over time, through the Republican era, as a means to deliberately conceal the actual roots of this practice and connection to the culture of the Mongols and the Manchus, which would have been seen as alien, weird, and somewhat barbaric to the general Han population at the time.
Emotional damage!
The Mongolians and the nomadic grassland people have been revered as great wrestlers throughout history. The practice of wrestling among Mongolians is indeed ancient, and it is an extremely important component of Mongolian culture and lifestyle, more so than any other group in China. Wrestling has been a constant feature in the lives of Mongolians, continuously, driven from their own cultural and spiritual beliefs, throughout the history of the people, irrespective of any external factors encountered along the way. We have seen how the importance of wrestling as a political tool between the Qing Manchus and their allied Mongolian subjects was the direct impetus for the establishment of the Shan Pu Ying, from which all Chinese Shuai Jiao has stemmed from thereafter. And while the collapse of the Qing dynasty ended the Shan Pu Ying, and with that the official focus on wrestling to that degree, it had no effect on the practice amongst the Mongolians themselves, who continued their practice of boh as part of their daily lifestyle and culture. We see evidence of this in a magazine called Liang You from 1935. While the official Republican national focus on Shuai Jiao was already in swing, the caption from this particular edition is very telling. It states, "Mongolians demonstrate wrestling. All of the Han participants suffered great defeat." Wrestling is part of the spirit of the Mongolian people themselves. This is a result of the lifestyle of the nomadic grassland people and the factors and environment in which they have always lived. The driving factor is the Mongolian way of life, and their wrestling skills and ability stem directly from this. Nowadays, we far too commonly hear repeated stories of martial arts being invented by someone due to them getting a sudden idea. We hear of simplistic reasons for some practice emerging, most of which are either illogical or, most importantly, completely ignorant of the environment, lifestyle, and general daily activities of the people from which said practice emerged. When looking at the roots of Mongolian wrestling, we need to clearly understand these aspects in order to know why their methods emerged and why they are so naturally skilled at wrestling. Mongolians, like all people who live in the grasslands, are nomadic herders. This is a necessity to live in that environment, which features a harsh climate with limited food availability. These factors make Mongolians completely reliant on the animals they herd for survival. The grasslands do not feature numerous species of differing plants growing, but, as the name suggests, is mostly covered in grass. Grass is not something that humans consume and survive on, but rather that which animals such as horses, sheep, cattle, and camels do. With that, the Mongolians may be called farmers of animals. Without their herds of animals, Mongolians would starve and have no clothing to protect themselves from the harsh climate. Their very survival has depended on their ability to keep and herd their animals, including the taming of horses, which are arguably the most important animals for survival in this environment, and the tool that both their armies and those of the Manchus used to conquer China. The Mongolians have had to catch, tame, and breed horses and other animals throughout their long history. The activities connected to this are directly related to wrestling, in that the capture, control, throwing, and restraining of animals are the core concepts and methods of any and all wrestling practice. For example, when catching a wild horse, in order to mount it, Mongolians hold the animal with their hands and use sweeps and trips to down the animal, after which they will mount and ride it until it has been tamed. They use a multitude of such techniques in these activities, including leg and hand methods, depending on the animal. Keeping herds of animals also requires Mongolians to castrate the males and also take down and hold animals, whether it be to slaughter them, shear them, or simply capture and restrain them. Naturally, over thousands of years, they have developed a multitude of wrestling methods utilizing their entire bodies to this end, and they would be extremely skilled at it. Watching nomads do these activities in their daily lives leaves no room for imagination as to where these skills emerged and originated from. These skills carried over into other avenues, including war, and indeed became a revered skill of the people, achieving a divine place within the culture of the Mongolians. While other groups, such as the Manchus, did herd animals, none had to rely on these skills so deeply as those tribes living in the grasslands themselves. This is the root of Mongolian wrestling, and indeed Shuai Jiao. The Mongolian people are an ancient, distinct, and separate people from those living in the historic central areas of China, such as the Han. The Mongols developed separately and distinctly from those groups, and have their own history, culture, spiritual beliefs, lifestyle, customs, and origin tales, which are not those of the Han people. Tales of what occurred with Churyo, Jiao Di, and the like are not connected to the reality of the development of the Mongolian people and their wrestling art. We can be grateful to the Republican-era people who promoted Shuai Jiao and were responsible for its survival after the end of the Qing dynasty up until today. And we should also recognize the great contributions to the art by prominent practitioners from then on. However, we should indeed recognize and admit the true origins and history of the art. As today's Shuai Jiao is directly descended from the Qing dynasty's Shan Pu Ying, which in turn is rooted in Manchu and particularly Mongolian wrestling, it is only right to give credit where it is due and recognize where it originated from and the people and culture from which it stemmed, and we should celebrate this. That ends this episode of Kungfu Explained and the series on the hidden history of Shuai Jiao. I hope you have found it interesting and enlightening. In the near future, I will release a video discussion on this subject with a prominent practitioner of both Shuai Jiao and Mongolian Boch, Lavelle Marshall. Keep an eye out for that, as many topics that we will be discussing go deeper into these arts. If you enjoyed this video, as well as my other endeavors, please do click like and subscribe. If you are able to, please support Mushin Martial Culture on Patreon. Your support enables me to continue producing this type of content. Until next time, everybody, keep training.